Here we go. Oh, boy. The cool kids have, Adrish has Geballe Vineyard.
Chardonnay.
Paul has Geballe Vineyard. We have the Zoom backgrounds on the website if you want to be in Geballe Vineyard for all of your, or you could be at the vineyard, you could be at the Cote Bonneville Estate, or you can even be at the tasting room if you want to be at the tasting room.
And you don't have to be masked up virtually.
Gotcha. That's good to know.
Or you can just be coming down the road before we put you together.
Can I be in Carrie's living room on our like 5th bottle of wine? Because that's probably more accurate.
We don't have a background for that, but that is scheduled post lockdown.
Why don't we have a background for that yet? I'm real disappointed.
Well, generally because we're smart enough to put the camera down before we get 5 bottles of wine in. So
Gus has a question.
Tony's gonna make sure there's cinnamon rolls as he's coming. Gus, what's your question?
We're having chipping lessons in the backyard. Carrie, you should be here chipping. Because you got to play next week from Friday.
I will.
Well, you guys all have to practice up so that you can keep up with her.
I promise I will be practicing my golf this afternoon after we're done.
Okay. All right. Well, Annie's here chipping now and teaching Cindy, so we're all set.
Okay.
I'm gonna make a fool of myself, but that's okay. Just so you know.
Well, there's Micah.
All right. Hey, Micah, nice to see you. All right. And TJ and Natalie are here. And so I don't know if we should wait another couple minutes. Is anybody, Micah, what are you drinking? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm actually drinking a Chard.
Well, good.
One of yours.
Yes. What vintage?
What year is it? 2015.
Perfect.
Yeah, perfect. That's what we're drinking.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Oh, that's that Northwestern blood. It's just running thick.
I almost wore my Northwestern shirt.
So, and hi, Ree. Ed, we do not have an update on phase 2. Don't know. So we'll let you know when we get there. But we do have an update on the vineyard, and we do have an update on the wine, and we do have all sorts of ideas for food and wine pairings for when we can have a party in the vineyard, which will be happening when we can. So the first thing I want to do is rub into the fact that you guys are not here because it's that kind of day. I went up to take some pictures, and I just want to share how beautiful it is in Sunnyside today. That was coming down the hill, and then up at the top from the Riesling. Now, I have not yet figured out how to take a picture of the mountains where they actually look as glorious in the picture as they do in real life. That's why we have Andrea, but it was beautiful. So anyway, that's how gorgeous it is in the vineyard today. And then Dad, I have to figure out how to unmute, and I'm going to let him tell us about the grapes right now. You can't get Dad unmuted.
No.
All right, Dad, you're live.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Cool.
Now I'm going to put the Syrah up. So there's your Syrah vine.
Okay. Can you make that a little bit larger or not?
I don't know. I can try. Because what we're talking about, does that make it bigger?
There you go. Okay. All right. So we've been talking about how bloom has been going and set. And so you can see the berries that have formed on there. And there's some others that are a little bit smaller. And then there are a couple that have brown caps on them. And Carrie can explain the process of the self-pollination that grapes go through. But the brown cap on there has a name that I've not forgotten. Stan Clark was probably the greatest teacher of vineyard in the state of Washington. And we were blessed to have him for 12 years in the vineyard. And one day we were walking through and he saw those brown caps and he said, "Those are fused calypteras." And I have never forgotten that term. And so I wanted to share the fused calypteras. And Carrie can explain what the brown caps, they're little parachutes that didn't come off. Go ahead, Carrie, explain what goes on.
So when we talked about flowering last week, and if you want a refresher again on my YouTube channel, I talked about this last Friday, I think. But what happens is the grape flowers open up, and in the cab picture, I think we can see the flower better. But so you can see some of these white flowers still in here. I'll zoom in on this one a little closer, and you can see the white flowers. And unlike most flowers that we think about, like the ones in the garden, soon to be my garden, you have your flower parts inside the petals. Well, grapes are backwards. You have the flower parts on top of the grape berry, and then you have the petals on top. So the petals open up and then they pop off usually. And sometimes they don't. There's a variety of reasons that they won't. But what happens in flowering is on the very end of the berries here, the pollen gets onto the end of the berry and then digs down and forms a tube that goes, and it has to fertilize the actual grape seed in order for the grapes to grow and for us to be able to harvest them. If the seeds don't get fertilized, is when you get these, instead of getting big like this, they stay little and they just dry out and fall off. And what happens if your calyptra or your flower caps don't pop off is that you don't have as much, it changes the environment at that pollen, where the pollen interface is. So what it means is your set isn't as good, your fertilization rates aren't as good. And we are seeing quite a bit of that in the Syrah this year, but at the same time, the set doesn't look as bad as one might expect. So they can still fertilize, it just lowers the percentage, it just lowers your chances of getting a seed fertilized. So then this is a cab cluster, on the other hand.
This is a cab cluster?
Uh-huh. Yeah, Zach, you can ask a question.
You can see the berry development is further along, and there are more berries on this cluster. Syrah berries will get larger than the cab, and so we're not worried really about the Syrah crop. But of all the different varieties that we have this year, Cabernet seems to really like 2020. And so we're not going to try to impede the development of beautiful Cabernet grapes this year. They're just going on. I do have one other thing to say, in that Kathy and I celebrated our 47th wedding anniversary yesterday. And I just have to give her a huge hug for being a saint for all these years. So that's the end of my report. You can unmute me or mute me.
Follow that, Zach.
All right, Dad, you're muted. Yes, there are two things that are liking 2020. One is Cabernet and one is my strawberries, or the other is my strawberries. And everybody else, the jury's still out. But I still have a few strawberries and they're delicious. So that's the Cabernet vine, the greater vine. So just kind of a screenshot of the health of the vine. Zach, what was your question?
Oh, I was just wondering if what we were seeing on the Syrah is that truly like Milrandage, or is it just an uneven set?
Is that truly what?
Like hens and chicks or Milrandage, or is it actually
No, hens and chicks is much more common in Chardonnay than it is in Syrah. So at this point, what you see is the difference in the berry size is basically this one is fertilized and is going to grow. These are not fertilized and they'll fall off.
Okay. So it'll be a more open cluster.
Mm-hmm.
It was very windy this year, which doesn't help for pollination. Of course, always depends when the winds come and all that, what the state of the vine is. We also had some rains off and on, which they don't like that either. In a perfect world, you have just nice warm temperatures and a little gentle breeze. But as we all know, this 2020 is not a perfect world. But
And
we're doing our best to make it a little more perfect.
yeah, the challenge is a lot of the factors that control how good your set is are all environmental. So as long as we're farming outside, and grapes is not a crop that's going hydroponic in a greenhouse anytime soon, it's not very controllable. So so the answer to your question, Adrish, is no, it's not really. There's not much we can do about it. So the good news is you generally get enough grapes every year to make wine. Some years we have a little bit less, some years we have a little bit more. But at this stage, if our set is really, really low, we can adjust with how many clusters we leave on the vine, for example. I mean, there's things the earlier you know about things, the more proactively you can farm and the more proactively you can make those decisions. However, this year, even in the Syrah, we wouldn't go to 2 clusters per shoot where we would normally go to 1, because your set would have to be really bad to make that drastic of a change. So it just means that we may have a little bit less Syrah this year. So yeah, shock and appall, I know. But one of the other things we want to talk about every year, because when Zach, who I should actually introduce more formally, but so Zach is here to talk about, he's our featured guest this week, to talk about food and wine pairings, because Zach is a somm. He does a lot of wine education. I will let him give you his whole biography in a while, but we've spent a lot of time talking about Chardonnay, so that we thought that was a good wine to showcase today. And we both independently said we should do an older Chard like the 15, and which I thought was funny. This is how you know we've been working together long enough that we have the same idea often. But we did what did we do last time? The 17 Chard? And 17 and 15 were both pretty warm years. And what I wanted to talk about, especially with the 15, is the consistency of the vineyard and the consistency of the vintages, and also how even in a warmer year, these wines are age-worthy, because this is an almost 5-year-old Chardonnay, and I think it's beautiful, personally.
I honestly think it's a little young, but that's just
Okay. And one of the reasons why is that, as we've talked about where this comes from in the vineyard, in this photo, you can see this was taken about this time, June 23rd. So about this time of year, and as the sun is setting, you can see that the Chardonnay, which is this block here, is already getting more shading. So it doesn't get as much sun in the middle or in the morning because of that aspect, and it gets shading in the late afternoon, in the evening. And so even in warm years, all of the basalt and the fact that it doesn't get as much sun, it does keep that acidity retention. So we get that ripeness, but it keeps the acid, which is so important for aging in wines like Chardonnay. So really, I think as we've talked about with all the white wines, winemaking is really important in making wines that will age. But especially with whites, you cannot do it without a good vineyard site. And so this is really it's a special little nook to plant Chardonnay on, and it's a fun wine to make. And I know Zach thinks it's a fun wine to pair. So I think we're going to let you tell us about start off by telling us about yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. So my name is Zach Geballe. I live in Seattle, and I am was hard to say in these times, the wine educator for Tom Douglas Restaurants here in Seattle, and the wine director at our flagship restaurant, Dahlia Lounge in downtown Seattle. I also am the host and producer of the Vine Pair podcast, and I do some freelance writing about wine, and then I also have my own business, Disgorged, which you can see on my shirt here, and that is I do online wine classes. Carrie was kind enough to join, and actually Kathy, because of some storm-related technical difficulties a couple of weeks ago. They were both kind enough to join me for a brief period of time a couple weeks ago when I was doing a class on the Yakima Valley. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the brief rundown. I've been heavily involved in wine, and in particular Washington wine, for over a decade now, and am privileged to consider the entire Shields family my friends. So I've been out to the winery and the vineyard a number of times, as mentioned. Had some bottles of wine at Carrie's house, and she's had a few bottles of wine at my house. So it's been a pretty good friendship to this point.
We put the camera down before the 5th bottle of wine.
Right. Probably before about the 3rd bottle of wine. My wife also pretended to be Carrie at a trade event one time, so we've got that going too. So anyhow, that's kind of my background. I wanted to say just 2 quick things before we get into the topic of pairing. One of them is that I am this may come out when we discuss this, but I am at heart a believer that white wine is better than red wine. That may not make me popular in this conversation. I apologize. But I think that making great white wine is harder than making great red wine. That's my opinion as someone who's never made a drop of wine in their life. So take that for what it's worth, but that is my considered opinion. And then I also think that Chardonnay is, and I mean, obviously you all are presumably here because you like, if not love, Chardonnay, but it's my spiel that I give, which is if you're the kind of person who says, I don't like Chardonnay, then I just think you haven't tried enough Chardonnay. It's such a malleable grape that is almost impossible unless you don't like white wine at all, in which case, see my previous point, I'm not interested in talking about it. That if you haven't found a Chardonnay you like, it's just because you haven't tried very hard, or someone hasn't tried hard on your behalf. So that's my bit.
And I would agree with you that white wines are harder to make than reds. They are technically more challenging, and you can't make mistakes. You can make mistakes with reds and cover it up or hide it much more easily with white wine.
The other thing is that, with the exception maybe of like the truly most expensive Grand Cru Burgundy, you can drink the best white wines on the planet for a lot less money than you can drink what are considered the best red wines on the planet. Not just Côte Bonneville Chardonnay, but if you were to say, like someone out here, I don't remember who, I apologize, who's drinking Burgundy, you can find great white from not just there, but I had the privilege of being in Alsace a couple years ago, and you can drink incredible wines, recently Pinot Gris, for $100. Like, I mean, truly exceptional wines. So it's another good reason to be a white wine fan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's Tony. He's in Burgundy because he lives north of the border.
Yeah, until the border's closed, he's approximating until the border opens.
He's doing the best he can.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure you can still ship wine up there, can't you?
No.
No, I guess you can, obviously. What am I saying? Yeah.
Mm-mm.
All right.
So he's planning a trip as soon as the border opens. He's going to come down and catch us.
He's bringing a 53-foot semi.
There you go.
So we usually do appetizers, and this week Zach gave us recipes that were not appetizer recipes, but so we're going to do the rest of the risotto for dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'm going to have some for an appetizer. So why did you choose these recipes?
Well, so and Ed, I saw your question, and I will get to that in a minute. I think the reason that I chose these recipes, so one of my things that I hate, well, okay, sorry, it's a bad way to start, but when you work as a sommelier and as a wine educator for a long time, like I have, you get asked a lot oh, what you had asked about food and wine pairing, and I don't, that's a big part of the job. I enjoy doing it. I like trying to drill down. But I think one of the things that I find frustrating, and maybe this ties into the conversation about why I prefer whites, is I find that often white wine is relegated to appetizers, to light fare, and people don't think of white wine as a wine that they can drink with dinner. And I could have been really out there and found a red meat recipe that goes with this wine, which they exist. But at the same time, I figured I would kind of keep this middle, like without getting too out there. But I think that with this wine, with Chardonnay, like the one that we're tasting here, with a little bit of age in particular, but even in a younger expression, what I'm looking at in terms of pulling flavors out, I'm looking for the weight and the body of the wine first and foremost as my sort of reference point for what kind of food I'm looking for. This is a powerful, imposing white wine, and so I'm looking for dishes that are going to, that are going to be pretty substantial. There's some tannin here from the oak and even maybe from the grapes, and so I want some fat in my food. So I want a kind of a rich, creamy risotto. I want chicken francaise, which is a dish that I also kind of be kind of fun. Like that's a dish I grew up on, and it's like not fancy really, but it like feels like it's like a fake fancy recipe, I guess is how I'd put it. And that's good for this time, for what we're all going through now. It's not that hard to make, but it feels kind of fancy in a way. And like I said, I think the problem the issue I run across a lot is that when we would do wine dinners at the restaurants and things like that, and I would want the main course to be centered around a great white wine, that might occasionally raise some eyebrows. And when I got a little more comfortable and a little more established, then I would be like, that's the deal. That's what we're serving. But I think it's important to not think about these wines only in the context of an appetizer. It's like nothing pisses me off more with pairing than someone who's like, oh yes, you should drink this white wine with oysters. And it's like, this is a great wine, but this isn't oyster wine. This is like entree wine,
I agree with that.
Mhm.
It is delicious with the risotto.
Yes.
And again, you're looking at matching, pairing is not always the hardest thing in the world. You're looking at matching at like flavors with like flavors if you're trying to do something pretty straightforward. And with an older Chardonnay like this, or with a Chardonnay with a bit of age like this one, you're getting some mushroomy notes for sure. You're getting a little bit of that kind of creamy, there's almost a brown butter note to the wine that goes really well with the sort of risotto preparation. And like I said, I'm looking for food that has some heft to it. So because the wine definitely does, and so I'm not looking to just kind of pick this isn't a wine that I would have with, I said oysters, but I wouldn't necessarily have this with I don't know, steamed cod or something. God, I hope you guys aren't eating that, but whatever it is. I like the salmon again. I mean, I have some. So I mean, I was doing some shopping today for just the family, and like I would have this with the pork chops I just bought. I would have this with, I think it goes great like with the dishes I recommended. I think this also can work really well with even like, I like this kind of wine with like a very like not super spicy, but like a mild like coconut milk curry. It works really well with actually, like with lemongrass and things like that. You get some of that citrus kind of flavor in the food, and the wine kind of plays really nicely off that. So there's a lot of options here, but like I said, the one thing you don't want is to pick a food that's so insubstantial that it's going to kind of disappear into the wine, unless you just want to enjoy the wine, which is also totally fine. That's obviously what I'm doing at the moment.
Okay, so food and wine pairing rules in general. You talked about pairing flavors, and you also talked about pairing textures. Talk about what happens if your flavors, like the pan-seared salmon that Idris had with Chardonnay recently or tonight. Like sometimes you can pair salmon with rosé. Sometimes I pair salmon with Carriage House. You can pair with Chardonnay. Like talk about
Sure.
thought processes.
So I think the biggest mistake that people make when they're pairing is they focus too much entirely on what the main ingredient is and don't think enough about the cooking method and whatever else they're serving with it. Because salmon's a great example. Wood grilled or like alder plank smoked salmon is going to be functionally very, very different in terms of its flavor profile than something like a pan-seared salmon or something that you've baked in the oven or something like that, let alone what you serve with that. If you go with mushrooms and wild rice, okay, maybe you're heading down one flavor path. If you go with asparagus and like my dad likes to, like a sorrel sauce, that's a totally different set of flavors, and there's a lot of different paths there. So the protein or whatever the centerpiece of the dish is important to consider. But honestly, I tend to think more and more with pairing about whatever else is going on, because that's going to more directly help clue me into what I'm looking at in a wine. I also think, the other thing that I would say is that there are sort of two fundamental approaches to pairing, right? There is the approach that says, what are the flavors in the food, or conversely, what are the flavors in the wine? And how do I align those two? How do I find, if the food has these flavors in it, okay, then my goal is to find a wine that also has those flavors in it. And that can be really good and really rewarding. I would say that at least as often, I tend to look at pairing as less about matching like with like and more about matching complementary flavors, but not the same flavors. Because to me, in the end, I don't actually totally want my food and my wine to taste the same. I mean, that's not really the point. If I wanted that, I'd just put it all in a blender. I think that for me, what I want is I want the wine to draw things out of the food that I might not have otherwise gotten, and the same thing with the food to draw things out of the wine. And so, as I was mentioning, I don't think you would necessarily think of the sort of like coconut curry based flavor set as being a natural pairing. If you look at you go Google, what do I pair with Chardonnay? That's not going to show up very often. But to me, with a wine like this, and Carrie can talk more about the winemaking, but that's got a bit of age, that's seen some oak, you're going to get a natural set of these kind of like honeyed flavors, which to me play really well with like ginger, lemongrass. You're going to get some of that sweeter citrus note. And to me, that's kind of the point of doing this at a higher level is, again, you're not trying to just say, okay, well, here are my flavors in the food. What wine do I know that has those flavors in it? That, I mean, again, just my opinion, but that's not always that intellectually or even, sort of sensually interesting. It's much more interesting to do something where you're trying to, in the same way that a dish is, a well-composed dish, whether it's in a restaurant or at home, is going to have multiple dimensions that hopefully work well together. You wouldn't just have, you don't just want one flavor to dominate or the same set of flavors. So that's a lot of what I think about is kind of what flavors do I know that work well together. And then, Carrie mentioned another thing, which I think is important, and I've hit on it too. I think the other part that gets underappreciated when it comes to pairing is texture. And texture of wine is a big sort of hobby horse of mine. I think that in general, in the conversation around wine, it gets ignored. I think that we focus too much on flavor, or because in some ways it's what is easiest to describe and easiest to in some way kind of codify. But I find texture to be equally, if not more important than flavor, because we respond to texture in wine and in food on a level that in some ways sort of sneaks in underneath our conscious brain, right? We think about what people tend to be turned off by in food, right? And if you're the kind of person who doesn't like certain foods, often it's the texture of the food more than the actual flavor that bothers you. And this was a revelation to me in part when I met my wife, because my wife is someone who is very, very driven by her preferences and dislikes are driven by texture in food and wine much more than mine were, or that I was aware that mine were. And so I think about that a lot more, having, since having met her, and thinking about how to kind of, as best I can, align textures. And again, it's not always just about matching like with like, but I do think that it is more important to match texture with texture than it is flavor with flavor with wine.
I would agree with that.
Mhm.
And I think that I also agree that it's not always something a lot of people think about, but if you have a richer dish, it's how you get into the red wine or red meat and white wine categories. If you have the rich white wines, and if you have a little bit of a lighter or more citrusy flavored kind of sauce on your steak, they do pair well together. And that's where some of those more unexpected pairings come from that are the really memorable ones. And it doesn't go back to looking at flavor. It goes back to looking at textures, which is definitely fun. So Zach, talk about texture. Wine texture.
Okay, we went into Zach's like weird philosophical realm. Okay, so
Okay, this is your show.
yeah, so when we talk, so
Let me
let
just
me
ask
answer.
something here. How would you put texture and weight? Maybe, how do you like the weight of the wine and the texture? Is that?
Well, I think weight is definitely a part of it. So okay, so I'm going to say this, and then Carrie, as the trained professional scientist, is probably going to tell me I'm totally fucking nuts, and I apologize for that. But what I would say is that to me, when I talk about texture, I'm talking about sort of the synthesis of a few different things. We're talking about alcohol in the wine, residual sugar, if there is residual sugar. We're talking about tannin. We're talking about acid. And we're talking about what I've heard referred to as dry extracts, glycerol, these things that lend the wine a weight, right? And so I don't know, all of you, how many different wines you've tasted, but presumably you've all tasted Sauvignon Blanc, and you've all certainly, or most of you have tasted the Chardonnay, right? And so if you look at Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc on one spectrum, right, you look at just the flavors, and we talk about, well, what are the key flavors in both? Well, you can find Chardonnay that has tart citrus, green apple, even some lime character. And you can find Sauvignon Blanc that you would say, yeah, it's kind of lime, maybe a little bit of green apple, but you would never, well, not never, but rarely would you find the two expressions of those two varieties that have a similar texture. Sauvignon Blanc is just inherently, typically very, very, I find it very lean. There's not a lot of weight to the wine. The wines tend to be lower in alcohol. They tend to have lots of acidity, and they just have, and again, this is just my terminology, so I don't know that it's always going to be transferable. I apologize, but they have just sort of a linearity to them. They feel very, focused, I guess is how I would describe them. And Chardonnay can be that in some expressions for sure, but even in places like Chablis, where you're going to get some of the leanest, most kind of focused expressions, there's still a little bit more, typically a little more alcohol. You're typically getting a little bit more, again, just palate impression. The wines are a little bit broader. And certainly when you start moving into expressions that are from slightly warmer places than Chablis, which isn't saying much, but whether it's the Côte d'Or or whether you're in Sunnyside or wherever, you're going to get a little bit more weight. And so that's a big part of it. I mean, again, I don't know how deep into the nuances of phenolic compounds we want to get here. Again, that's more kind of Carrie's world than mine. But what I will say is that to me, that's a hugely important thing about texture is that, when you strip away as best you can when you're drinking wine or tasting wine, flavor. And that's really hard for us to do. We're hardwired to be cognizant of flavor. But if you can strip those things away, I think that you find that you can also differentiate between a lot of different wines based on texture. I mean, that's a lot about when you're learning blind tasting, what a lot of it is about, because flavor can actually mislead you a lot. Texture tends to be a lot more consistent within various different grape types and growing regions, whereas flavors can vary a little more or just be more complicated. I feel like there's some other questions here. Okay, so examples of
there is, but before we get into orange wines, I want to add, I'm not going to disagree with you, Zach, because I don't always disagree with you, but just for the sake of pushing, because,
Sure.
We push each other to be better, which I appreciate. With Chardonnay, one of the things that happens with the Surly's aging is, so lees are the junk at the bottom of the barrel. So you have the grapes come out of the press and you have your fermentation and they're cloudy and it's murky, and because with the yeast producing carbon dioxide, everything's being stirred up. And then when it stops fermenting, all that stuff settles down to the bottom. So it's the solids of the grape, it's the yeast cells, it's the dead bacteria that all die down to the bottom. And one of the reasons we stir those you stir the lees into the wine and incorporating it. And this is the reason why Sir Lee's aging is so important, is that those yeast cells break open, and the autolysis or breaking open of those yeast cells releases protein into the wines. And this does a couple of things. It causes stability. By going through the aging on the lees, that's how we can bottle this Chardonnay unfined and unfiltered. You would have to, for stability reasons, if you're going to make a technically correct wine, if you don't go through full ML and the time on the lees, which really you can't do any shorter than we do. If you have lees aged Chardonnay for a year, then it's filtered, or it has to be. But you get these proteins that get into the wine, and they confer stability, but they also confer a lot of this texture, because they're really short proteins that get into the wine that are from the yeast that give it that roundness and that richness. And it's really interesting to taste Chardonnay throughout the process while it's aging, because you taste it in the barrel. If you taste it every month in the barrel, it gets subsequently richer and richer and richer, and those things keep building. And it's actually because of the proteins.
Yeah.
So
like I said, I just wasn't sure if I could say autolysis, but now
Not
we're
a bad
done.
word. It's okay.
So I just was going to say too that I think the question about what are some examples of matching texture. Well, I think the dishes I picked out here, I intended to be matches in terms of texture. I think that, you think about, how do I describe it? You think about like a wine that's got weight, and let's actually step out of white wine for a sec. I know this is not what we're talking about here, but let's talk about red wine instead. So, and hopefully some examples that are pretty familiar. So something like Pinot Noir, right? So Pinot Noir's texture typically comes from some combination of tannin, alcohol, depending on where it's from, especially oak, possibly. But generally speaking, you're going to find a Pinot Noir has a sort of, again, not the same as Sauvignon Blanc, but in some sense, it's going to have a less weighty palate impression, and just a sort of delicacy is the best way I can put it. With exceptions, of course, there are certainly exceptions, but some delicacy to it. And contrast that to something like Cabernet Sauvignon. And again, there are some beautiful, delicate, elegant expressions of Cabernet Sauvignon out there, and there are some absolute monsters out there. But Cabernet, just because of the physiological characteristics of the grape and the way that the wine is typically made, is going to have more evident tannin. It's going to have often, but not always, more alcohol, and that can actually be pretty even depending on where you're talking about. But more than that, the tannins themselves, because of the combination of the tannins in the grapes and in the oak barrels that it's often aged in, are going to be, in its youth in particular, more assertive. And so I think about those things when I'm trying to do pairing, and I think about, okay, so if I have one wine that requires a certain amount of or that has a certain amount of delicacy to it, well, I probably need to pick food that's also going to, in some sense, offer delicacy. It's one of the reasons why actually I don't love a traditional pairing for Pinot Noir, which would be something like people often talk about duck and Pinot Noir, and I actually think that's a terrible pairing, or not terrible, it's just not great, because duck is generally not very delicate. Duck is like a meaty, kind of fatty, bird, and so I think Pinot Noir actually does better with even something like dark meat chicken, or as well as salmon, those kinds of things that do have a little more delicacy to it. And Cabernet, on the other hand, is not even the most powerful sort of full-bodied red. So I actually think Cabernet does great with things like duck, and maybe not as great with something like a really, really fatty cut of meat. There are other wines that I might go to for that. In any case, I also saw there's a question about orange wines. Okay, so my thoughts on orange wines. I am mostly a fan. I think, like anything, right, there are good, bad, and otherwise examples, but a thing that I do love about them is I like aromatics in my wines in general, and so depending on the variety used to make orange wine, you often get really heightened aromatics from your white grapes, and I find that to be really enjoyable, especially when it's paired with a really kind of dry, almost austere actual like flavor set. One of my favorite examples from locally is a winery called Two Vintners makes something called OG, which is their orange Gewürztraminer, and that wine is super floral on the nose, but all just almonds and these bitter notes on the palate, and like bitter orange peel and stuff like that. And I really enjoy that wine. I think that one is super fun. Back when Dahlia Lounge was open, we poured it by the glass, which was really cool. Kind of a fun opportunity to try stuff with guests who maybe had never had orange wine before. Do I think we'll see more of them? I mean, maybe slightly more than we've seen, but I think they're always going to remain kind of a niche category, which frankly I think is fine. I mean, they're not what I want to drink all the time either, but in the right setting with the right food pairing, absolutely. I do think they're pretty fun food wines. You know, they bridge a lot of gaps that are otherwise kind of challenging with whites or reds, just like rosé, kind of in a different way. Rosé is a great sort of, well, I don't know what else to pair here, so I'm going to go with rosé. Orange wine kind of functions in the same fashion.
Well, and for those of you who aren't as familiar, rosé is red grapes made like a white wine, so not a lot of skin contact, and orange wine is white wine made like a red wine. So normally you don't ferment the whites on the skins. Orange wines, they do, so they have a lot of tannins and they can be bitter. And honestly, because Scott, you asked what my thoughts were, I do think the best place for orange wines is definitely with food and definitely with the right pairing, because on their own, they can be I find them weird often. Yeah. I mean, like that OG, it's a weird wine. With the right food, super cool. But just to sit around and have a glass of wine it's not generally my preference. So I think if you have as restaurants open up, and I think this is a really good call for why sommeliers are important, and why when you go to a restaurant with a good somm, you don't necessarily just order. You say, hey, what do you have? What kind of experience can you give me that I can't get at home or with takeout or anything like that? Because I don't tend to order those wines. But Kara at the Barking Frog introduced me to the OG, and it's that's the beauty of having somms to ask the questions to when you go to restaurants. And because even if you're not going to drink a whole bottle of it or 5 and then take a picture or not, for the restaurants that have these wines by the glass, it's an excellent opportunity to try something you're not always going to try, especially with the pairing that you're not always going to think about. And I feel like the wonderful thing about hanging out with people who do these pairings more often is that it also helps. You can talk about pairings, but it's good to have a guide, and that's where somms are really helpful, and we should utilize them, especially as people start dining again. Yeah, because that's why they're on the floor.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also, that it comes back to that kind of thing I was talking about before, which is sometimes, the idea for a pairing is not always like with like. Sometimes you're looking for contrast in your pairings, and that's something that, I'm typically, when I'm working on the floor, I'm not going to recommend to someone unless they show a certain willingness to go that route, which is not everyone. That the OG is a great example of a wine that, I knew when I put it on our glass pour list was not going to be for everyone. It was going to sort of suit a certain audience and serve certain needs, and I liked what it could be with our menu. But I also knew that, we did this with all of our wines, but I certainly knew that with anyone who ever ordered a glass of it, we were going to ask them basically, have you tried this before? If not, have a taste before we pour you a glass, because it's definitely not for everyone. And that's, I don't think that's a problem. I think that's a cool thing to have. It just means that from a service standpoint, you have to be a little more prepared.
Okay, so pop quiz, which you're not prepared for, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Me? Okay, great.
So the last, when we did the class a couple weeks ago, you tried to tell me that I should make a red Cab Franc.
I did.
And since I am making a red Cab Franc to be released this fall, what are you going to pair it with?
Well, I feel like this is a difficult question because I don't have the Cab Franc and I haven't tasted it. But I would say
Really
that
good or we wouldn't have made it.
Yeah, and talk us through your thought process too, not just the answer.
sure. So okay. I am if I'm particularly passionate about any red wines, especially here in Washington, they would probably be Cabernet Franc and Syrah as far as individual varieties, because I tend to think that they are both very expressive of where they're grown in Washington and also of very high quality. Cabernet Franc here typically, and from some of the other, whether it's the rosé that Carrie makes or the some of the surrounding vineyards and wineries that I've tried their Cabernet Franc. I mean, to me, that's a variety that actually lends itself really well to a few different expressions. So one is my aforementioned duck, which is, on my mind because it's one of the things that we're best known for at Dahlia Lounge. So I get asked about pairing that a lot. And in particular here in Washington, where the Cabernet Franc tends to take on a sort of note of like cardamom, cumin, these sort of like toasted spice, like hard spice notes I really enjoy. That's one area that I might immediately go. I also think that Cabernet Franc goes really well with a lot of our sort of wild mushrooms. So things like morels go really nicely with it. Again, it often has a sort of woodsy character to it in a really pleasant way. Paul, I will answer your question in a moment but I don't want Carrie to get mad at me before I finish this one. And I would say that the other direction that I like to go with something like Cabernet Franc here in Washington, and this isn't necessarily the main component of a dish, but it's an example of what I was talking about with looking at some of the other components. I love Cabernet Franc here in Washington with lentils. I think it goes really, really beautifully. There's something about the earthiness of the lentils that almost brings out more of the fruit in Cabernet Franc without kind of clashing. One of my favorite things to have, there's a restaurant called the Kosho in Seattle, and they do a really good, they make just beautiful lentils with like a house-made sausage, and those two plus Cabernet Franc is delicious. I love that wine. Or love that pairing, I should say.
Sounds like an Adrish kind of menu that we're going to be doing.
I was just going to say, you gave me a great idea. I just made a lentil thing earlier this week with cardamom and cinnamon and bay leaves, and I was like, that would pair really well, I think.
Yeah. And then, okay, so the question from Paul about favorite Syrah and Cabernet Franc. Oh my God. Okay, you're recording this, so I'm on record. So, oh my God.
I can edit this part out later if you want.
I don't want to upset anybody too badly. I would say I think the people who do the best. We'll start with Cabernet Franc. So I think I think Andrew Will, who was one of the wineries that I featured in my class, my Washington wine class series. I tend to find that their expressions of Cabernet Franc are really, really remarkable. I also think, see, now I'm getting put on the spot. Covington Cellars, Morgan Lee's wine, he makes really excellent Cabernet Franc. I also just did, it's not 100% Cabernet Franc, so it's a Cabernet Franc based blend from Cadence on Red Mountain. A little different side, a little bit more powerful side. I lean a little more towards some of the Yakima Valley Cab Franc with a little bit more delicacy. I tend to lean that direction very slightly. Syrah is a trickier question because there's so many different not that there aren't great producers of Cabernet Franc here in Washington, but I'll tell you who I had in my class, because those are people who I think of as some of the best producers of Syrah in the state. So that would be two vintners, W.T. Vintners, and Lotta. I like K. Vintners a lot. I think some of their wines are quite good. I think, but with Syrah, again, you're getting into this realm. I will tell you the one, and this is maybe going to raise some eyebrows, whatever. The one winery that I would not, that I've never been, well, I've had some good examples from, but I've had mixed responses with is Cayuse. I think sometimes the wines can be really remarkable. Sometimes they can be kind of to me just kind of opaque, not in their color, but in how I approach or how they kind of, if they express themselves to me. But they certainly are real expensive, so they got that going for them.
I like that you mentioned WT, because WT Vintners is one of the other wineries going with us to France next year on the river cruise. So if you want to drink Syrah with Jeff and me in the Rhone, come on the cruise. It's going to be fun. I guarantee it. And it's the only thing on my calendar that's not tentative or canceled. So I'm super looking forward to that trip.
What are the dates of that? I would like to go.
It's June. It's on the bottom of all the emails. It's June of next year. And the link at the bottom of the email takes you to the website that has all the details and all the info and all the stops and everything.
Okay, Scott, I have to comment on this. Why are you drinking Torrontes? No, you're muted. I can't get your excuse.
In Argentina.
I guess. But there's all kinds of other great whites in Argentina.
Okay.
I don't know. Torrontes just to me is like, I find it's one of these things that's like, the florality of the wine is too much for me. Like it just kind of overwhelms anything else. But I think that actually so the best pairing advice I have for really floral whites. So maybe Torrontes, I think something like Gewürztraminer is a great example of this as well, or certain Viogniers. So this is, pardon me, this may be a little bit gross, but you're just going to have to deal with it. That the best example or the best explanation I was taught once long ago was that you should use really floral whites the same way that people in Europe use cologne or perfume, which is basically to cover up something stinky. So they're great with like kind of like funky like cheeses. They go really well with organ meat, things like that. So if those aren't things that you're eating or preparing at home regularly, I certainly understand. Sweetbreads are not on my daily menu either here, but they do go really well in that setting. Also, like something even not something that's stinky, but like foie gras or even like a chicken or duck liver mousse goes really well with those kinds of wines.
Well, that's interesting because I had thought that, I would say that I agree. I think they're overwhelmingly floral and I'm not a particular fan. And I thought maybe I just hadn't found the right pairing to put with it, but maybe it's just not the greatest.
I just wouldn't bother with Torrontes if it was me. I've yet to have one that I think is all that good. I mean, I haven't tried all of them or even many of them, but it's a wine that's like a blind tasting possibility. So I've tasted them a lot. It's not to say there are no redeeming characteristics, but it's just, if I'm going to drink a floral white, I'm going to drink, like I said, Gewürztraminer, Viognier, those kinds of things, Muscat even, before I reach for Torrontes, personally.
Okay, I will say in defense of Torrontes, having gone up to Salta after my Argentine vintage, if you get good examples, they can be balanced and not overwhelming. I think Viognier is a great example. I think a lot of times, especially in the New World, Viognier can be really floral and oily and not incredibly balanced. And I think the more experience that growers and wineries have with the grape, those things change. But I think with everything, it's like Riesling. Everybody who says I don't drink Riesling because they had a bad bottle of Riesling doesn't mean you don't like the grape. It means you don't like the bad ones. I mean, the only grape that we all say, oh yeah, I've had some bad ones and I don't like it, is Cabernet for some unknown reason. Because I've had some really awful Cabernet that I don't want to drink again. And I would agree that there are fewer examples that I love of Torrontes, but there definitely are examples that exist. I would go to not random generic Argentine Torrontes, but if you can get to more high elevation vineyards, I think in Cafayate they have the highest elevation vineyards in all of Argentina. And I forget the name of the producer I was at, but it was like the highest vineyard in Argentina. And their Torrontes was nice. I don't know that it was their best wine, but it was not something that I would say stay away from.
Okay, but to prove my point here, if Carrie is talking about having to go to the highest elevation vineyard in Argentina and like, okay, there's just one producer that makes one and it's okay, it's pretty good. Like, I feel like I've proven my point.
Hey,
but a lot of those things don't get exported either. So, I mean,
all I'm going to say is the $5 bottles that have the picture on the back that tell you to turn them into a wine spritzer is probably not the best example of a drink alone wine. It might be a great spritzer if that's what you're into in the middle of the afternoon on a hot day in the middle of summer on the deck. But I feel like with everything, I mean, there's just fewer examples of Torrontes than there are of something like Riesling. So it's hard to say that it's hard to make the generalizations. I have had some good examples. There's more than one. If you do get a chance to go to Argentina, go to Geballe. It's an amazing place. Can you find them here? I don't know. Is it worth seeking them out? That might be kind of like orange wines. But there are plenty of floral wines in general. One of the reasons I like our Syrah is that it has I think it has a very lovely floral note. And so I think super floral wines like Torrontes can be hard to pair. Wines that have some floral in them, like Viognier or like a lot of Syrah, if it's an element, and flowers are pretty. So when I look at food pairings, if you're looking at like with like or complementary flavors, I like the fact that when I pair things that have like with Viognier or with a floral Syrah or something, I like, if you're looking to bring out more of the delicate part of the group of the food, whether it's, the duck that needs some balance in the lighter direction, or then some acidity and some floral notes can balance that richness and heaviness, depending on what's on the duck. And it gets back to balance, and floral is a characteristic that lifts and adds more delicate notes. So when I think about pairing conceptually, why are you putting these two things together? Are you putting these two things together so they enhance each other, or are you putting these two things together so they balance each other? And so like to Zach's comment that you put flowers on something that's stinky so they balance each other out, or you can put something bright and light on something that's a little bit, that needs that lift because the food doesn't have it in and of itself, and the wine is the accessory that brings it up. That's kind of how I think about floral pairings.
Okay. Oh, okay. Paul, I'm glad you're okay that I gave Christoph a hard time, apparently. So the Sevilla wines, I actually poured their Syrah by the glass for a while. I like them in general. I haven't tried a lot of them, but I've had a few, and I think they're generally pretty well made. I mean, generally speaking, Rock Syrah is one of those things for me that I only occasionally am in the mood for. That's probably part of the reason why the Cayuse wines don't do it for me all that often. The sort of like very funky but very high pH, weird kind of soapy wine just doesn't like do it for me entirely. But in the right setting with the right wines, for sure it can. I mentioned, Key Vintners. I mean, I think they make too many wines for me or too many Syrahs for me to say, here's my overall opinion. But I think Brandon Layton, the winemaker, is very good, and their approach is very for a winery of their size, they're all native ferments. They're very low intervention these days, and I think that's pretty cool. And then I'll be honest, Barrister, I think I've tasted a couple times, but those wines don't make it to the Seattle market that much. It's certainly they're not in distribution out here that I'm aware of, or if they are, it's a small component. So they don't, I feel like a lot of their wines are more on the east side of the state from what I've seen. I've seen them more in Spokane than I have in Seattle. I don't know. Were there other questions? I've got to head out in a couple minutes because I have a 2-year-old who needs dinner. So it's gonna be.
And what will you be pairing with this dinner?
So we actually are making. I made a bunch of. I have a bunch of frozen dumplings, basically like wontons, and so we're going to be steaming those and eating them because I find that fun again, sort of fun flavor pairing with these things. And also they're pretty quick, which is a plus.
All right. And then Aussie Shards, Adrish wants to know.
I mean, Aussie Chardonnay is like, it's like saying, what are my thoughts on American Chardonnay? Like, there's a huge range, right? So you can go everything from crazy, full-throated, super, high octane, lots of oak, lots of tropical fruit, to I've had some really good examples from like Western Australia that can be really restrained and elegant. I think those wines are amazing. There's a small importer in the Seattle area called Red Earth that brings in some really interesting wines from Australia. I will say, if we're talking about whites from Australia, to me, Hunter Valley Semillon is still the most exciting white wine in Australia, although there's some great Riesling too, but there's very little in the world like Hunter Valley Semillon. And I love, there's something about, and to just get back to my thing about texture from long ago or things like that, Hunter Valley Semillon is one of these sort of weird examples in the white wine world of a wine that is a very lean style made from a grape that tends to want to go kind of rich and opulent. And there's something about the tension between those two things you get in those wines that with some age resolves itself really nicely, and the wines are just electric. Again, not to talk about another winemaker here in Washington, but Andrew Latta, who I mentioned when I was talking about Syrah, makes a Roussanne, and he's traditionally made a Roussanne in the sort of a little bit more full-bodied with some oak style, and he's just released his 2018, which is we made two different styles, and in 2018 he made one that's more like how they make it in the Savoie, and it's again that same kind of like picked early, but this variety that wants to get rich, and it has this great electricity to it that I love. So yeah, I don't know, I got way afield from Aussie Chardonnay, but sorry.
No, I agree with you though. The Hunter Valley Semillon it's so unique and different and interesting that it's really wild though, because young, it's not that special, but old, it's really interesting and really cool.
Yeah, it's I don't know if any of you out there are football fans or Seahawks fans, but I think of those wines as like DK Metcalf. Like, they're incredibly muscular, but also really fast, and you don't really understand how that's possible. And so they're kind of the equivalent of that in white wine.
So, all right. Well, we will let you go because we know that you have a super important date.
I'm going to give my 30-second pitch for my next wine class because.
Oh yeah, you should. And we love Italian wines. I love Italian wines. So go.
So my next class. So I mentioned a few times that I just finished a series on white wines, wines of Washington. My next class is red wines of Italy. I will be traveling virtually with my class to Italy because in real life we can't do that yet. But it'll be a 4-week series. We'll do 3 wines every week. I'll be co-teaching it with Haley Black, who Carrie can attest is an amazing wine professional. She's super knowledgeable and just really passionate about wine, but Italian wine in particular. And so 4 different classes. The first one will focus on Tuscany, and particular Sangiovese. The second will focus on Nebbiolo, particularly in Piedmont, but also in other parts of northern Italy. And then we'll do some wines in the southern part of Italy, and then finish up with kind of a little bit of grab bag of some of the other greatest hits. Carrie's already provided, you've all seen the email. The email she sent out has my contact info and the links to that. But if any of you are interested, it should be a lot of fun. It's a great opportunity to learn and taste some really good wines. And I'm really excited about it. Italian wine was my first love in the world of wine. And so it's something that's near and dear to my heart.
Yeah. And Italy's my enological home away from home. And Haley is an expert. She spent a ton of time there. And I forget the certification, but she's got the Italian wine certification. So
yeah, she's one of the Italian wine ambassadors. There's only 8 of them on the planet or something. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. So the if you lost the email, deleted the email, and you want Zach's info, feel free to email us or ask me. I can get it to you. And if you want more Chardonnay or older Chardonnay, let me know, because I went and checked what we had, and I will pull out some library Chard for the Zoom Wine Club. And So, and thank you guys for showing up this week or every week. This is super cool. I'm glad that everybody's having fun, and I'm happy to pull some Chardonnay out of the library for you guys. So
Taking it right away
Thank
from
you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
yeah, I'm gonna get in trouble for this, but all right. Well, next week, who do we have next week? Daniel.
Yeah, Weber for the cheese.
Is he next week? Yeah, he must. I think so. I don't know. We're zooming through the month. So next week is Daniel Waverin who makes the Bonneville cheese with our Syrah, and we'll be drinking Syrah because that goes with the cheese. We do have some cheese, so if you guys want some cheese, let us know. And if Tony was on, and not just if he was able to talk, he would give a shout out for Daniel and the cheese because he loves that cheese. And so we will see you guys next week. And Zach, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, good. And yeah, Carrie, I will look forward to opening 5 bottles of wine with you again soon.
Yeah, I look forward to that as well. So
It might have to be 6 in 2020.
there you go. Yeah, exactly. And I think at some point we'll just have a big old wine and food tasting pairing party, and we'll all drink a whole bunch of wine, and probably all put the cameras away at a certain point. But it'll be super fun.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.
Bye.